He was accused of defying the court, then mocked in front of a live audience, but within minutes Tom Homan flipped the script and took down the very man wearing the robe. Tom Homan didn't come to play nice. The marble floors of the federal courthouse in Salt Lake City echoed with the weight of what was about to happen. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the hallway from filling with reporters, eyes wide, microphones in hand. Everyone knew this hearing would be tense. No one expected it to go nuclear. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge James Boasberg sat perched above the room, his expression unreadable. He had made his position clear a week ago. Deportations under the Alien Enemies Act were halted at least until further judicial review, but the administration had moved forward anyway. Flights out of Phoenix and Miami were confirmed. Dozens of Venezuelans, some claiming asylum, were now gone. Tom Homan, former acting ICE director and known for never backing down, stood at the defense table in a Navy suit that looked like it had been worn through war. His tie was slightly loose, his jaw was clenched. He looked Boasberg square in the eye. "Your Honor," Homan began, voice steady but sharp, "the Department of Homeland Security acted within the scope of a law that's been on the books for over 200 years. You may not like it, but that doesn't make it illegal." Judge Boasberg leaned forward. "Mr. Homan, this court issued a temporary restraining order. You ignored it." "No, sir," Homan replied. "We responded to a national security threat. We used legal authority. What we didn't do is wait for permission." From a bench that's been swayed by politics more than precedent, gasps from the gallery. A court officer straightened in his seat. Boasberg's brow twitched. "Barely, but enough. You're accusing this court of bias," Boasberg asked, voice low. "I'm saying the law should stand on its own," Homan said, then paused. "Without influence from nonprofits feeding you arguments behind closed doors." There it was. The needle twisted deeper. That last line wasn't rhetorical, it was personal, and Boasberg knew it. The room fell quiet. Even the rustle of legal pads stopped. "Mr. Homan," Boasberg said, voice rising, "you are here under subpoena. You do not lecture this court, and you certainly do not question my integrity." Homan didn't flinch. "Then don't make this personal, Judge." The heat in the room was palpable now. You could feel it. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was the kind that made your skin tighten. Judge Boasberg sat back, gripped his gavel, but didn't strike it. "You want to defend actions that violate my direct order. Fine," he said coldly. "But don't pretend you have credibility left. Your track record speaks for itself." That line changed everything. Boasberg didn't shout it, he didn't slam his gavel, but he said it in front of the courtroom, in front of attorneys, journalists, and 3 members of Congress sitting quietly in the second row. And in that moment the issue wasn't about deportation or executive orders or even immigration. It was about pride, reputation, power. Homan stood there, eyes locked on Boasberg. Then calmly he reached into his briefcase. "I was hoping we wouldn't need this today," he said, "but I won't be accused of corruption by someone who should be recusing himself from this case." He held up a sealed manila envelope. It had a red sticker on the flap marked "Internal Confidential Report" on the back, the signature of an agent from the Office of the Inspector General. Murmurs filled the courtroom. Boasberg's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" the judge asked. "It's a sworn affidavit," Homan answered, "and it doesn't come from me. It comes from one of your own." But before anyone could respond, the clerk stood up and announced a brief recess. Boasberg never asked for it. He just nodded once, stood up, and walked out the back door without a word. 15 minutes later the courtroom reopened, but it felt like an entirely different place. Gone was the stiff order of legal proceedings. What remained was tension, sharp as glass, and every single person in that room knew something had cracked. Boasberg hadn't returned yet. A deputy judge took his place for the time being, stating that the matter was under review, but no one was thinking about procedure anymore. Every glance, every whisper, every phone screen lit up in laps, all centered around the envelope. Homer had dropped like a bomb. Outside in the hallway, Tom Homan stood next to his attorney, Miranda Foley, a former federal prosecutor with a history of calling out judicial misconduct. She leaned in and whispered something only he could hear, but Homer barely moved. He kept watching the doors like he was waiting for something or someone. "Back in 2017, Miranda said finally, her voice low but firm. "Boasberg tried to block ICE from accessing criminal databases tied to sanctuary cities. That was personal for Tom. He never forgot it." Tom Homan had spent over 30 years inside law enforcement, building his name by showing up where others wouldn't: raids, courtrooms, congressional hearings. But this case had hit a different nerve, because for months he'd heard whispers about backdoor coordination between immigration courts and advocacy groups, and Boasberg's name kept popping up. Nothing direct, nothing provable, just enough to make you wonder who was really pulling the strings. The affidavit in his hand was a statement from a former court assistant named Caleb Ristow, 36 years old, soft-spoken, kept his head down. Caleb had worked inside Boasberg's chambers for 5 years until 2 months ago he vanished from the court roster without explanation. He had written under oath that Judge Boasberg maintained informal contact with a nonprofit called Human Horizon Legal, not illegal by itself. But the group had submitted amicus briefs in this exact case, strongly urging the court to block deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. According to Caleb, he had been asked to run redrafts of certain briefs often before they were officially filed. That alone wasn't standard protocol. It wasn't even remotely appropriate. But the worst part, some of those edits came before the nonprofit ever sent the documents to the court. That wasn't legal. That wasn't even gray area. That was tampering. Boasberg returned 20 minutes later. His robe still on, but his face was different now, less cold, more rattled. Homan had already taken his seat again, Miranda beside him. She looked directly at the judge and didn't blink once. "We've received the contents of your submission," Boasberg announced stiffly, "and for the record, I categorically deny any impropriety. No one accused you yet," Miranda replied coolly. "That's the problem." Gasps again. Homan leaned forward just slightly, elbows on the desk. "I'm requesting a formal hearing on judicial misconduct," Miranda continued, "and I'm requesting your immediate recusal until that hearing takes place." Boasberg didn't answer. He stared at her. He stared at Homan, then finally looked over to the court clerk, who had gone visibly pale. "Court will take a recess until further notice," he said abruptly, and stood again, but this time 2 U.S. Marshals stood near the side exit, not by accident, not for show, and for the first time all morning Boasberg hesitated, but the minute he stepped off the bench, Holman's attorney handed a copy of the affidavit directly to the marshals, and the doors closed behind them. Without another word, they say there's a line in every courtroom, an invisible one. You can argue, challenge, protest, but you don't cross that line. That morning Judge James Boasberg crossed it. What he said to Homan wasn't part of legal discourse. It wasn't judicial restraint or even controlled anger. It was something deeper, personal, calculated, and designed to cut. It happened just before the first recess, in the final seconds before the envelope was revealed. Most people missed it in the chaos, but the reporters sitting in the front row caught it. So did the court transcription software, and once the word got out, it spread like wildfire. "You've always been good at playing the patriot," Boasberg had said. "Too bad no one with real power ever took you seriously." That line didn't come from a place of legal disagreement. That was a man trying to humiliate another man publicly in a federal courtroom with cameras outside and reporters waiting for Tom Homan. It wasn't just offensive. It was a threat to everything he stood for. He had been through Senate hearings, riots, public backlash. He'd been called names on live television, but that insult delivered by a federal judge was the first time he felt like the system was no longer pretending to be fair. It was just naked power, unmasked and unbothered. When the second session resumed that afternoon, Boasberg didn't sit behind the bench. A temporary magistrate named Judge Marianne Ross handled the docket. She was calm, neutral, and didn't show a trace of emotion. But the air had changed. Miranda stood first. She didn't wait for permission. "Before we begin, Your Honor, I'd like the court to hear the full reading of the affidavit so the record is complete." Judge Ross glanced at the marshal standing near the witness box. "Proceed." As the marshal read Caleb Ristow's statement aloud, the gallery sat frozen. The claims were precise: dates, document versions, file names, internal memos. Caleb had even attached metadata showing when Boasberg had reviewed early draft briefs weeks before they were filed. The courtroom wasn't just listening, it was processing the scale of what had just been revealed. Holman's face was calm, but his fingers tapped a slow, steady rhythm against the table. When the reading ended, silence took over again. Then someone near the back stood up, an older man in a gray suit holding a press badge. He wasn't supposed to speak, but the moment took him. "If this is true, the judge tampered with case law before the trial even began." Ross didn't scold him. She simply said, "That's not for this room to decide," but the comment had already landed across the street. Inside the U.S. Attorney's Office, investigators were already pulling case files from Boasberg's previous rulings, every case involving Human Horizon Legal, every brief he'd allowed, detained, or cited in his opinions, because now it wasn't just about this one case. And back inside the courtroom, Ross finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Until further notice," she said, "Judge Boasberg will no longer preside over this matter. The Department of Justice has been notified. The court will cooperate fully with any investigation." No emotion, no elaboration, just the hammer dropping. Tom Homan didn't smile, he didn't nod, he just looked down at the table for a few seconds, then closed the folder in front of him. "You think this is about immigration?" he whispered to Miranda, barely audible. "It's about rot, deep, deep rot." But even as the gallery began to clear, someone else slipped out a side door with a burner phone already in hand, and within minutes, the entire thing hit social media word for word. By the time the affidavit reached Capitol Hill, Caleb Ristow's name was trending online, even though no one had ever seen his face on a quiet street in Fort Collins, Colorado. Caleb sat alone in a rented apartment above a closed dry cleaner. The blinds were drawn, his phone was off. He hadn't spoken to his family in 2 weeks, not since the day he sent the documents to the office of the Inspector General with the words "for urgent review" scrawled across the subject line. He never expected it to go this far. Caleb wasn't a crusader, he wasn't looking for fame or a book deal, he just couldn't keep printing briefs from a nonprofit that kept showing up on Boasberg's private calendar when he was explicitly told not to question it. It started small, calendar entries labeled community outreach, but Caleb knew the names. One of them belonged to Leonora Fetch, lead legal strategist at Human Horizon Legal. Another belonged to Bernard Weil, a longtime donor and political advisor known for pushing boundaries in the name of immigration reform. Both had ties to cases Boasberg had ruled on, but the breaking point came during a lunch meeting Caleb wasn't supposed to overhear. Boasberg had invited Weil into his chambers. Caleb had just stepped out to grab a document when he heard it clear as day. "You give me language that'll hold up under scrutiny and I'll give it weight," Boasberg said. "Just keep it quiet." Caleb froze. He didn't understand all of it, but he knew that kind of collaboration wasn't allowed, not between judges and outside groups submitting briefs. Not when rulings affected real people's lives. He stayed quiet for weeks, but it aided him. He wrote everything down: dates, times, meeting notes. He compiled screenshots from internal servers showing the edits and tracked IP addresses of those who accessed the files. Most came from within Boasberg's office. A few came from Wiley's personal firm, and when he left quietly without notice, he mailed a hard copy to the DOJ, then disappeared. Now watching the news feed scroll across the screen in front of him, Caleb wasn't sure if he felt relief or fear. Back in Salt Lake, the affidavit was already causing ripple effects. Legal watchdogs were calling for an audit of every ruling Boasberg had made in the past decade. A subcommittee in Congress announced an emergency hearing to review ethics standards in federal courts. Meanwhile, Tom Homan was pulled into a side meeting with two federal agents from the Inspector General's office. They weren't there for a press moment. They wanted names, timelines, and details only someone inside the system could provide. They'll try to bury this, one of the agents said flatly. The judiciary protects its own. Not this time, Homan replied. Not when they thought they were above the law. The weight of what was happening hadn't fully hit yet. It wasn't just a political scandal, it was a breach of trust in the one place where people were supposed to find fairness. Judge Mary Ann Ross released a formal court order later that evening. Boasberg would remain suspended pending review. All of his active cases were reassigned. The affidavit, now verified, was sealed by federal investigators as part of a growing probe. The media had only just begun circling. Every network anchor, every podcast host, every political blog, left and right had a take, but beneath the noise one quiet truth had settled in the minds of millions watching. Something real had just cracked open, and it started with a court clerk no one had ever heard of carrying a secret he never wanted to hold. But just as the DOJ began preparing formal inquiries, a second whistleblower came forward, someone who claimed Boasberg's behavior went even further than anyone realized. It was just past 6 p.m. when the courtroom emptied for the day. The air outside had cooled, but inside the federal building things were only getting hotter. Judge Boasberg's chambers were now considered a restricted area. 2 U.S. Marshals had been stationed outside his office door. No one was going in or out without clearance. The judge hadn't been arrested, not yet, but that didn't mean he was free. Inside an adjoining conference room, Boasberg sat across from two deputy marshals and a DOJ ethics investigator named Elise Graydon. She wasn't there to be polite, her questions cut like wire. Did you ever receive preliminary copies of amicus briefs from Human Horizon Legal before they were publicly filed? Boasberg didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped the armrest once, twice. I can't recall the sequence, he finally said. That's not an answer and an answer. Graydon replied, either you did or you didn't. Boasberg looked down, his throat moved as he swallowed. They were drafts, nothing final, and it wasn't like that. Like what? She pressed. They weren't influencing rulings, they were context. Graydon leaned back in her chair. You edited arguments submitted by a group directly benefiting from your rulings. That's not context, Judge, that's conspiracy. Outside the room, Tom Homan paced the corridor with Miranda. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. The system they both thought they understood had just turned itself inside out. A federal agent walked by, gave Homan a tight nod. This one meant something. They were moving by 7:20 p.m. Boasberg's office had been entered under a sealed search order. Investigators took 3 hard drives, a stack of personal notebooks, and 1 unregistered external USB that wasn't on any government inventory list. That drive would become the center of a separate investigation later, one with even darker implications. For now, though, the focus was on what they already had: Caleb's affidavit, the metadata logs, meeting records, and now a second whistleblower, this one from Human Horizon Legal, who had quietly turned over 6 months of internal emails showing coordinated messaging strategies shared directly with Boasberg's law clerk. Meanwhile, the courthouse was swarmed with media vans, boom mics, and flash bulbs. Protesters had started showing up too, not the usual activists. These were people angry about corruption, betrayal, and the idea that justice was now something you had to dig for instead of expect. Inside the federal holding office, Boasberg was still not officially charged, but his options were shrinking by the hour. Back in the main lobby, Homan stood alone by the large glass windows. Reporters tried to shout questions through the barricade, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the building across the street where the DOJ had set up a temporary review team. Miranda walked up beside him and handed over a copy of the official notice just released to the press. Judge Boasberg placed on administrative leave pending federal investigation. It read, DOJ confirms cooperation with Office of the Inspector General and U.S. Marshals Service. Allegations of misconduct deemed credible. Homan took the paper, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat. You think this is justice? Miranda asked. No, Homan said without looking at her. It's just the beginning. But as the news made its way to Washington overnight, a quiet storm began building, because Boasberg wasn't the only judge those nonprofit briefs had reached. By sunrise the next morning, Washington, D.C. wasn't waking up. It was already in motion. The halls of the Capitol buzzed with private calls, emergency briefings, and hushed conversations behind locked doors. A handful of lawmakers had been up all night, not because they were directly tied to the case, but because they long suspected something like this might eventually surface. The scandal surrounding Judge Boasberg was no longer confined to one courtroom. It had opened a crack in the federal system that no one could ignore. In eyes, the Judiciary Committee's Chambers Chairman Lowell Strawn reviewed the affidavit with a look that said it all. This wasn't just bad optics, this was exposure, dangerous exposure. There's at least 3 judges flagged in this batch of filings, Strawn told his staff, 2 in Arizona, 1 in Southern California, all referenced in the same communication chains from Human Horizon Legal. The emails pulled by federal investigators overnight showed recurring patterns, suggestions for legal phrasing, document exchange before filing deadlines, and pre-meeting calendar events marked with vague terms like community alignment and policy sync that alone didn't prove corruption, but when paired with Caleb's testimony. And now the second whistleblower from inside the nonprofit, people started asking the right questions. Who else knew? Meanwhile, back in Salt Lake City, Tom Homan was on a secure line with the Senate Oversight Council. The conversation was measured, but there was an edge to it. This doesn't stop with Boasberg. Homer said if they were passing around legal strategy like a group chat, you better believe it reached further than this building. The Senate office promised a hearing not just to address Boasberg's case, but to re-examine the way amicus briefs are handled altogether. For decades, third-party groups had used them to influence policy under the guise of legal perspective. Now those quiet little documents were under a microscope. Back in D.C., political factions took their predictable side. Some defended Boasberg, calling the investigation a right-wing smear campaign meant to derail immigration protections. Others leaned into it hard, saying it was about time judicial activism was exposed for what it really was: a power play masked as compassion. But in homes across the country, in Kansas City and Fresno and Dayton, regular people weren't arguing legal theories, they were asking something simpler: can you trust the judge sitting at the front of the room? Networks ran loops of Holman's confrontation with Boasberg, slowed down and captioned his quote, "Then don't make this personal." Judge had already become a meme, but not because it was funny, because it felt raw, honest, familiar. Americans had long suspected that fairness in the system was uneven, but now they had something concrete. Someone with status robes and federal protection had taken sides before the gavel ever hit the wood. Inside the Department of Justice, Elise Graydon was already expanding the scope of her investigation. They were forming a task force quietly with no press release. They didn't need another headline, they needed evidence. Back in Fort Collins, Caleb Bristow watched the coverage unfold from his apartment, still hidden from view. His name had leaked, but his location hadn't. He saw his own scanned affidavit appear on the screen, highlighted line by line. He muted the television and turned off the lamp. Then he sat in silence. In some corner of his mind, he thought maybe he'd feel better by now, but all he felt was tired. Meanwhile, Miranda Foley was already preparing her next move. Holman's name had been floated for testimony in front of Congress. She was pushing for it not because it would boost his profile, but because the public deserved to hear what he saw behind those closed doors. The way decisions were framed before cases were even heard, the silent pressure, the favors disguised as outreach. This wasn't over. If anything, the hard part was just beginning. But before anyone could catch their breath, an internal memo leaked from the DOJ, and it suggested the next judge under scrutiny might already be preparing to resign. The memo hit inboxes just after 8 a.m. on a Thursday. It wasn't meant for public eyes, but someone inside the DOJ had had enough. It was short, just 4 paragraphs, and it named a second federal judge under quiet investigation. This one was based out of San Diego, with a similar pattern of interactions involving Human Horizon Legal and early drafts of advocacy briefs. And just like that, it was no longer a Boasberg story, it was a systemic story. Cable news picked it up. Within the hour, headlines shifted from scandal to suspicion. Political analysts started referring to it as Briefgate, though most people didn't need a label to understand what was happening. This wasn't about left or right, it was about people who were supposed to be impartial choosing sides. In silence in Salt Lake City, Tom Homan stood outside the courthouse with Miranda by his side, speaking to a growing group of reporters. His face wasn't angry, it was tired but resolute. "I don't care what side of the immigration debate you're on," he said, his voice steady. "But when judges start taking advice from nonprofits before the hearing even starts, that's not justice, that's choreography." He paused, then continued, "We fought wars for the idea that you walk into a courtroom and have a fair shot no matter who you are. What happened here, that's not just a legal failure, that's a betrayal." The crowd listened, some nodded, some just stood still digesting what they were hearing. Homan didn't want fame from this, he never did. He wanted to walk into courtrooms where the fight was fair, even if it was hard. He believed in law and order, not when it served him, but when it stood on its own, even when it was inconvenient. Behind him, reporters yelled out questions. Would there be indictments? Was Boasberg going to jail? What did the DOJ know? And when Homan didn't answer, he turned to Miranda. "You think anything changes after this?" he asked, quieter now. "Depends on whether people are actually paying attention," she said. Later that evening, a round table was aired on national television. Judges, legal scholars, and former clerks debated the meaning of what had just unfolded. Most agreed it was a wake-up call. Others said it was just the beginning. But across the country, in living rooms, break rooms, and kitchen tables, Americans were having a different kind of conversation, one that didn't need legal degrees. They were talking about trust, because if you can't trust the courtroom, what's left? In Fort Collins, Caleb finally turned his phone back on. Dozens of missed messages, some from reporters, one from a cousin he hadn't heard from in years, two from a blocked number. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he sat down and opened a blank document on his laptop. He didn't know what he was going to write yet, maybe a letter, maybe a record, but something inside him said the truth still had more to say. In D.C., the Judiciary Committee voted to open a formal inquiry Into amicus brief practices across federal courts. Quietly, more whistleblowers began to come forward. Not all had smoking guns, but their stories matched the pattern. The cracks were real. This story started with a confrontation, a tense back and forth between two men in suits standing in front of a judge's bench, but it ended with a question that every American had to answer for themselves. What happens when the people who promise us justice stop playing by the rules? Because justice isn't a robe or a bench or a gavel. It's a choice every day, every case, every voice. In the moment we stop expecting honesty from those who hold the most power, we give that power permission to serve itself. If you've made it this far, ask yourself what fairness really means, and if you believe in accountability no matter who's in the spotlight, then subscribe, because we're just getting started.